Was there any difference in this season's rains compared to last couple of years?
So in the NCR, this year has seen more extreme rain events.
And a large part of our flooding problems have occurred because the roads that have come up have completely neglected those systems.
The presence of natural areas close to the city and even integrated with the city has almost become a global norm for high quality living.
How do you extend metro network which has been stuck at that level for a very long time?
So Gurgaon apparently, generated 65% of the income of the state in terms of tax and all, but the municipal bodies are basically starved of funds.
Hello, welcome to this podcast organized by Gurgaon First on Gurgaon. My name is Amit Bhatt and I work on the topic of transportation. And today we have with us three residents of Gurgaon who are also experts in their own field. And we'll be talking about problem, issues and challenges faced by the city. This is the series of podcasts. This is the first podcast. We'll be doing many more in the coming time. But let's kickstart the conversation. Let me first introduce you to the panelist over here. We have with us Chetan Agarwal, who is an environmentalist, a policy expert who works on the topic of environment and is a resident of Gurgaon. We have Mukta Naik with us. She is an architect, urban planner, works on the issue of urban planning, but also equity, gender, and some of the other important aspects. And then we have with us Swanzal, who is the co-founder of I Am Gurgaon. And she has some very, very exciting topics to discuss with us. So let's kickstart the conversation. Let's start with Guru Jam. The rain is over, but we saw a lot of flooding in Gurgaon again. So my question first to Chetan and then we'll come to Mukta. Was there any difference in this season's rains compared to last couple of years?
So in the NCR, this year has seen more extreme rain events where rainfall has been concentrated in a small period of time and it's crossed all records. So for example, in Delhi last month, there was one rainfall episode where 238 roughly of rainfall fell within a 24-hour period and mostly within a 4 to 6 hour period, which is 1/3 of Delhi's and Gurgaon's annual rainfall. And that was at one spot, and so that's the day when we had the real kind of jam when people were stuck in Gurgaon and Delhi. And the Guru jam you're referring to was, I think, July of 2016. I still remember that. And that's when people took 6 hours, 8 hours to reach home and all. And where the highway was jammed, many places were jammed. So we are a semi-arid zone. So we don't get that much rainfall. If you think of it, there's places which get 1200 mm, 1500, 2000 mm. Cherrapunji was apparently 10,000 mm. So we have, but because we have built so fast and in a somewhat unplanned way, where we have, Gurgaon has private developer-led development. So all our master planning is majorly influenced and I would almost say captured by private developers. And that has what has driven the master planning, not the basic work of, what your topography and your nalas and protecting your green zones and your blue zones and then building along that. So Noida, we don't hear of this in Noida, for example. So what's so different? Noida has more rainfall, probably, or similar rainfall. But we don't hear of this in Noida, but Gurgaon we do. So that's the main.
Interesting. So you said we don't hear about this in Noida. So maybe Mukta, since you are an urban planner, is there a fundamental difference between the way, let's say, Gurgaon was planned versus other cities in NCR? And if so, some of the key points, what are the differences?
Right, thanks. So I'll pick up, Chetan already introduced a little bit of that there is a real estate first kind of approach to development. And Haryana and especially Gurgaon sort of led that kind of urban development where developers were actually given permissions to not just develop, but to also consolidate land parcels directly from landowners. So they were involved in how the city was shaped at a very early stage compared to the traditional form of urban development where the government does that job. So the state acquires land conventionally as per what urban planners perceive as the way the city should grow. They acquire the land, the state acquires it, the state puts in all the basic services and infrastructure, and then when it is urbanized, then as in it's ready to develop, then it brings in either putting in land directly in the hands of homeowners like you and me as plotted development, or to developers who build different kinds of commercial and residential real estate. So that did not happen in Gurgaon. Here we have a situation where the developers were involved right from the beginning, and perhaps the expertise that we need to make sure that all these different aspects of the environment and the new population that's going to come in is taken care of right at the envisioning stage. That didn't happen because it was a very fragmented process as compared to a traditional planned development where however good or bad the capabilities of the planning body are, there is a process in place where you're doing feasibility studies, you're thinking about the water runoff, you're thinking about how the traffic will move right at the outset. So however bad it gets, there's some sort of infrastructure in place, there's a grid in place. In Gurgaon, we kind of innovated and retrofitted the city as we went along because this was a much more haphazard and, fragmented way of growing.
So I'd just like to kind of follow through from what Mukta said, a little bit about Gurgaon's planning before I come to what you just asked. And it's very interesting that apparently Gurgaon was planned by two draftsmen, planned to whatever extent it was, in the town planning department. So, and conventionally it's understood to be a patchwork city where literally field after field was acquired by developers, and that's how the city grew. So it has truly been a city that has struggled with its infrastructural needs, and clearly a complete disconnect from the natural drainage systems, and especially for a city which is entirely reliant on groundwater. I think the statistics are that we're withdrawing 3 times what we're actually putting back, and only 30% of stormwater is actually getting back into the ground. I mean, these are the statistics that are available. And what's very interesting is that, like, even Delhi has nalas, but Gurgaon has bunds and has creeks, which were the way that water was actually naturally drained from the Aravallis into and collected. And a large part of our flooding problems have occurred because the roads that have come up have completely neglected those systems. So there was a very interesting, I think this was about 3 years ago, when there was a suggested proposal to actually create a box drain that took water away from Gurgaon. And that's when the Gurgaon team actually got involved with this. And we presented to the GMDA and MCG and worked with Terry to do a water study of how this could be actually solved on the ground. We took about 20 officials from GMDA and MCG into the creeks to actually show them that this is viable, living spaces that can actually take care of the entire problem. And I think at a cost of the first year, about 40 lakhs is all that the government spent on cleaning these creeks. And the following monsoon, there was no flooding on that particular Golf Course Road stretch because the water was actually being diverted into the creeks. And that's something that we've consistently been doing in most of the spaces that we're intervening in, because it's a very simple solution. You know, it's actually going to lead to groundwater recharge. It is taking the problem away, and it's the simplest and most logical way to actually deal with something which is not a problem, but it's a resource. It's being converted into a problem because we are not applying simple logic to, and what is evident, like, you know, it's amazing. And actually I have to say that I had, I personally discovered these creeks in 2021 after about 20 years of living in Gurgaon. And I was amazed at the blindness. So what I really want to also say here is that, you know, we unfortunately live in such motor-dependent cities. That's a tragedy of all our cities actually today, especially the metros, where nobody's walking on the ground anymore because there are no spaces to walk. Gurgaon has an issue with no sidewalks. But I think it's a very interesting thing to even realize that you just didn't realize that there are these beautiful spaces and there's such an opportunity here to actually, I think my dream would be to just have these green fingers where you can just walk through the entire city, and it's actually a positive experience. You're taking away the pollution generated by cars, and it's actually a viable option. We now have created 15 kilometers of pedestrian trails over the last 15 years in Gurgaon.
Absolutely. And I think walking is probably fundamental to any city, because irrespective of what mode you take, almost all of us are a pedestrian, either the first mile or the last mile or the full mile. And so the question is then, how do you create streets which have at least walkable footpath? And then so that's very interesting that 15 kilometers of dedicated pedestrian pathways has been developed. The big question is, how do we scale that from 15 to 150 to maybe 1500 and then probably all street? And that is going to be a big issue for us. The other important issue that we always talk about Gurgaon, and represent myself, is waste. Where I live, outside the window, I could see Mount Bandwari, which is rising day by day. So what can be done with the issue of waste? Again, there are multiple solutions which have been proposed, but how do we resolve this issue of waste?
Challenge in Gurgaon is that, when you're in a gated community, like an apartment complex, almost all now are following a process of segregation because it's mandatory by law for them to be doing that. The question is, what happens to the dry waste? Our learning was that if you actually segregate your dry waste in your homes and send it to recycling stations, the challenge is there are many upcyclers, but there aren't spaces for citizens to go and actually take that waste, right? And then there is a whole process of how you have to manage this dry waste in your home. So whether it's washing your milk packets, washing your cheese plastic, for everything from dry cleaning tags to, becoming so conscious of it, the solution lies in the home. So it's very clear that the problem will just disappear overnight if each of us just take responsibility in our own homes and say, I am now watching every shampoo bottle, I'm watching every washing, sending. It takes a little bit of effort, but once you do it, your weekly waste comes down to like half a kg. That's all that you will be generating. Currently, the Gurgaon statistics, I think, are about 1,200 tons of waste. Yeah.
I'd present a little bit of a counter view. Of course, I agree completely, and there's enough research and experience around the world to show that home-based segregation is the solution. But we also know that when we rely on individuals and households for change, the change happens at a very slow pace, and Mount Bandwari will keep growing by the time we affect that change. So I think, as a planner and as someone who's worked on community-based solutions, and I'm, quite a fan of participative and community and neighborhood-based solutions. And even across cities in India, we see that there is an intermediate intervention at neighborhood level for creating waste segregation infrastructure and for engaging, a group of people who've been doing this traditionally or who are happy to do this at remunerated set of people to do it for you. So you achieve some bit of the segregation within the home, abroad, at least wet and dry. And then the dry can get sorted and get sent into and then you also have this kind of infrastructure that Swanzal was talking about that connects these centers to the back end, which is doing the recycling. So my point is really that, and who will do this? It's partly a process which the government can help set up and incentivize us to set up, and partly it is civil society and communities who need to invest in that and say, but we need to strike a balance between people putting in effort and a process being in place to make it really easy for them. I think there was a period in life where whether we're talking about air pollution or whether we're talking about any of these environmental causes, there was a period of time when the public discourse was every individual should take it up. But as a policy, sort of somebody who observes policy, I feel like we've gone over that hump and now people are feeling a bit cynical about that we're doing so much in an individual level and yet nothing is changing. No. So I think we need to strike a balance here. It would be great if the individual efforts could be recognized. And I think the waste recycling and the segregation in communities in Gurgaon was actually encouraged because the municipal corporation had a program of rewards in recognition for many years in which RWAs were rewarded and they could put up plaques. And so everybody feels good when their efforts are recognized. So we need to do that recognition at household level, at community level, at neighborhood level, maybe even at ward level, to sort of get the city in some sort of a healthy competition with each other and, then achieve our goals. We need to think a little bit about how to strike that balance.
No, absolutely. How do you strike that balance is important. And the other issue is, maybe if I am doing and my neighbor is not doing, how will it impact me?
Yeah.
And the other thing which I've heard from a lot of people is that, look, I segregate. But when I put that waste, give it to the waste collection agency, the agency again mixes it together.
That's an incentive problem.
Yeah.
And you can always say that, your waste is a mechanism for someone to make a lot of money. And apparently the tipping fee for Banwadi was almost 1,000 rupees a ton for a long time. And now I read recently that it's been reduced to 390 or something around that. And the rest was basically a surplus which was being apportioned between the various stakeholders. So the cost of transport. And so if there's so much surplus in sending more, in per ton of waste going to Banwadi, then there's no incentive to segregate and reduce your volume, because every ton you take to Banwadi, you'll make a lot of money.
So we've been talking about waste, and the way we stand right now, a lot of it is because we have done some things in the past which is also impacting us. So Chetan, could you highlight some of these legacy issues that we are dealing with waste?
So the big legacy issue is that about a decade or 12, 15 years ago, we decided that all our waste can go into one treatment facility, which was a fraud in Badwadi. So the way Badwadi was designed is that there was to be a treatment facility which would treat the waste, and only segregated waste would go there. And the inerts which are left post-treatment, the rest would become the compost, which would be sold, and the inerts would be kept in a landfill. So that landfill was designed only for inerts. So it doesn't have the kind of lining which you need for a regular landfill. So, and then that treatment facility, I am told, never worked. Then it caught fire, and the guy who had set it up got his insurance money and disappeared. And apparently his facilities, he has other facilities in the country, they also caught fire. So this is not the only fire incident. So basically we have a site which is not lined properly. It is under-engineered, and it was engineered for supposedly only for inerts which are non-toxic, and there's no leachate happening there. Now we've been getting for more than 10 years, we have been getting mixed, unsegregated waste. So whenever it rains and then the leachate comes out, so the biggest legacy issue we have is that we have a toxic waste dump contaminating our groundwater at a certain pace, and that is reaching the city from the eastern side. So the eastern sectors of 58, 59, Bandwadi apparently is already the groundwater is contaminated, and that is approaching the city. So this is one huge issue we have to deal with, because we didn't plan it properly. And now, because this compost is being spread out and used for filling up, landfilling in multiple sources, there's a real risk we are contaminating our topsoil also. And the plan to then incinerate, the waste in the future. So we are going to contaminate our air also. So the solution to, and the reason this was happening is the tipping fee. Because if you're going to pay someone 1,000 rupees a ton or to send stuff to Bandwadi, then his business model is to send as much volume of waste to Bandwadi, because that's how they make money. Because the fee was so high that there was a lot of surplus in that. So because the whole model was based on, the incentive was to send as much waste to Bandwadi and generate probably as much tipping fee as you can. So the system was not interested in either getting you to segregate or keeping it segregated. That's my basic understanding. So now if we are going into a new contracting system, the incentives need to be looked at very carefully, that we incentivize that the company or the agencies are incentivized to force citizens and promote citizen segregation, and then whatever they're getting, they keep it, they do further segregation. I think that's the key issue here. And we have an empowered committee apparently of senior officers and some citizens. So, we should really be able to crack this. If towns like Indore have done it and other towns in India have done it, the Gurgaon is not that large.
Absolutely. No, I think because I have seen at least Indore for last 20 years, and I have seen what it was before and what it is now. Massive improvement when it comes to waste and waste management. So it's doable. It's just that how do we start? Maybe we can look at dry waste as something to start. So what do we do with dry waste is one. Maybe you can share some examples. The other issue which I also want to touch upon is the construction and demolition waste. Because if you drive or use any mode of transport from Gurgaon by the road, both sides are filled with C&D waste. So what do we do with the C&D waste is also a big question.
So, I think I Am Gurgaon has been engaging with the dry waste issue since 2019. In fact, a lot of it started with whichever areas that we were actually rewilding and reforesting, we realized the larger job was first to remove all the waste that was dumped in those spaces. So that was the realization that, these were all areas which were neglected and therefore they had just become waste dumping zones. And it started with this idea of, we actually did this very interesting awareness campaign called Where Does It Go, which we started in 2019, which actually we were hoping to get citizens to start thinking about, where is this waste going? I mean, what I'm dumping in my waste bin. And there was a artist called Arun Kumar H.G. who worked with young artists to develop installations out of waste. So we actually kind of had a whole outdoor exhibition of these beautiful art installations made out of waste, and lots of children came in. And that followed through into the same space, was converted into what we called a Samadhan hub or solutions hub, where we basically set up a dry waste recycling station with 8 different types of waste, from thicker plastic, multi-layered plastic, glass, e-waste, paper, metal, etc. And we were really looking at how do we create a space which can connect, be the bridge between citizens and upcyclers, and also educate them on the impact of what it means to groundwater, to air pollution, to marine pollution, all the various aspects of plastic not being upcycled. And I think it has been a fairly successful venture, because I think we've grown to now 4 recycling stations, and we've managed to upcycle about 186,000 kgs of waste in the last 4 years, including the COVID years when for a year actually nothing was really achieved because people were not coming out. So I think that this is a very viable model. If currently, of course, the scale is small because it's a small organization doing it. But if the government took this up as a very tangible exercise where you distribute these recycling stations across Gurgaon, where people can just walk to the recycling stations, because that's the whole idea, that you don't have to come in a car to deposit your waste, because that becomes kind of counterproductive. And I think we can find solutions for the city where, the research says that if you're already segregating your biodegradable waste, which is typically 60% in most Indian homes, because we have a lot of fresh food that is cooked. And if you remove your dry waste out of that, you're left with barely 5 kgs of waste a day. I think it was a week. Yeah, a week. So it's like reduced to a small quantity. So that can really be a solution for the city that's very viable, very doable, and hopefully something that, I'm hoping that we see more of.
And then any reflections on what do we do?
So, C&D waste is very interesting that it's interesting that you asked this, because, at some point while we were working on all these various pedestrian trails and forest corridors, we realized we are paying for brickbats, we are paying for building material. And our whole approach to material sourcing changed. So literally it was like we would look out and see if there's any cement waste lying on the road, and we'd say, okay, let's pick it up. So from the second project onwards, Wazirabad Bandh, we started taking all this cement waste and utilizing it in our projects. So we've actually taken the C&D waste out of the city and made it into a resource, brought our costs down, and really made it into like a sustainable. The Badshapur Forest Corridor was almost entirely made out of waste, where we used, cement waste. We've used stone, broken stone and patterns on seats and pathways. So really, concrete blocks. So it's really this, if you just kind of flip this idea of waste, C&D waste on its head, it can become an incredible resource. This is something the government could do so successfully at a scale where we would have no problem with C&D waste, because if you and it's just being creative about it and being intentional about it. If you do that, you can, all these institutional spaces where we're just doing grit and, cement ad nauseum.
In fact, a clear one of the things, I was speaking to a Singapore-based landscape architect, and now it's becoming a global norm for the state, for the government, to actually create an auctioning system where C&D waste is given into specific spaces. So just like you have collection spaces for dry waste for citizens, construction companies and contractors can put in their waste at designated areas from where other people can pick it up at auctions, in which it goes much cheaper than buying fresh material. And plus you get incentive, either tax breaks or some other form of incentive, or extra FSI, or there are so many other ways that you can incentivize builders and contractors to keep on increasing the amount of material that they're picking up from this waste auction, rather than from buying fresh materials.
So on that, one of the issues that also comes up is that when you talk so Gurgaon is a global city, right? It has about 200 or 300 or Fortune 500 companies present here. And when you're looking at a global workforce to come to global cities, they also want a quality of life. And one issue is air quality. And we are just at the cusp of the air pollution season, so as to start. So what are we doing to address this? And Aravalli is a great lungs, so as to say, for the city and the NCR as a whole. And there's always this threat which is being posed. So if you could talk a bit more about Aravallis, its importance for a city like Gurgaon, and what can be done to preserve the lungs of the city.
So Gurgaon and Haryana is basically an agricultural state. So any land which could have been cultivated was more or less put under cultivation. So our forest is only surviving in the uncultivable hilly areas. So in South Haryana and Gurgaon, it's in the Aravallis. And it's a scrubby, dry, deciduous forest. It loses its leaves at when it's after the monsoon, but and then there's a fresh flush of leaves so it's very attuned to the water cycle. So the little Aravallis we have are there are green belts, there are green lungs, there are groundwater recharge zone, there are habitat for wildlife, for birds. So for example, after the Aravalli Biodiversity Park was set up, and that 380 acres has been restored by Gurgaon over 10 years, the number of bird species which are coming there and are either living there or visiting has gone up to over 240. And in the beginning, there would have been 5 or 10, 15 max. So we have 240 species, different kinds of birds which are coming and resting and visiting that area. Insects, butterflies, rodents, animals, mammals, maybe 10, 15 species. So we have a model for how we can restore the Aravallis in an intensive way. And the whole Aravalli belt form MG Road. So one side of MG Road has been restored. The other side, there's the Nagar one. But after the Nagar one till Ghata, there's this whole stretch of Aravallis which is prime for protection and restoration. And that is also under, it is not under threat so much from encroachment, but it is under tremendous threat from real estate projects. And there's a 350-acre patch there in Wazirabad, which are Aravallis, which has been, auctioned off in 2009 or so for a real estate project. And that has mired in the zoning for the Aravallis. Basically, we have three kinds of protection for the Aravallis. What is it zoned for? Then is it a forest or not? Then the forest laws will apply. In Gurgaon, we have the Aravalli notification which says that construction in the Aravallis is prohibited. So And finally, there's the ownership angle. Who owns the land and what do they want to do with it? So the forest department doesn't own any land really in the Aravallis. It is with the panchayats, and in the urban areas, it's with the municipal bodies by and large. So it's not with the forest department. So those lands need to be transferred to the forest department so that the agency which has the land is also interested in conserving them. If it's with the municipality, then they're thinking ki, we can do so many things. Of course, forest is just one of them. Second, in terms of the zoning for the whole NCR is provided by the NCR Planning Board in the form of a regional plan for the NCR. And that's our super duper master plan. It's above everything else. And that sets the direction for what has to be conserved in the NCR. So the regional plan 2021, which is currently in force, has a category called Natural Conservation Zone or NCZ. And all Aravalli areas, all forests, water bodies, water nalas and all are supposed to be put in the NCZ. And the limit on construction is, real estate is not allowed, only 0.5%, that too for regional recreational activities. So something like the Biodiversity Park, 350 acres, you could do a maximum of 0.5% if you needed some supporting infrastructure.
What do you mean by that? Like walking trails or
Some toilet.
cafes, administrative space, interpretation centers.
Okay.
So, but the new regional plan which is being prepared, it has deleted the word Aravallis, it has deleted the word forests, it has deleted the word conservation from the natural conservation zone. Now that it's become natural zone, as if conservation is not the objective anymore. And most importantly, the 0.5% limit has also been deleted. So currently we have the old plan which has all this protection, but the new plan in the pipeline, the builder lobby or whatever has basically, all this protection has gone. So fortunately, it's been reported recently in the press that the PMO has stepped in and told the NCR Planning Board and the Urban Ministry that you stick to the old plan provisions of the Natural Conservation Zone. So the real question is, it is an intent. If you want to conserve the Aravallis, then your zoning should say conserve and don't build there, which we have right now, and it needs to be protected in the new plan. Secondly is the question of, are they forest or not?
Yeah.
So there also it has been highly contested. There are some parts of the Aravalli, maybe about half are notified under something called the Punjab Land Preservation Act, and those areas are treated as forest. That has been contested by the government in the Supreme Court and they've lost. They tried to bring an amendment in 2019 which was stayed by the Supreme Court, which would have made it non-forest. And so as of now, we have the protection that PLPA notified special section 4 areas will be treated as a forest, and they'll have the protection of the Forest Conservation Act, which means you can't use it for non-forest purpose easily. But the remaining about half of the Aravallis are not notified under the PLPA. So those need to be either notified under PLPA or notified as protected forest, or if we are not notifying, then we have this provision that if it looks like a forest, then it should be treated as a forest, the deemed forest as a dictionary meaning. So basically, over the last decade, citizens have come together periodically and they've to challenge each of these things which the government has been doing. So activists have come, the Aravalli Bachao movement has been set up, especially when the amendment was passed in 2019. So that's when a lot of people, a much larger group of people came together to protect this.
You know, Amit, you started this question, you framed this question as Gurgaon as a global city. And I think we need to go back to that. So in the sense that even our metro station is now Millennium City Center, there is a desire there are a lot of India headquarters of global companies that are based in Gurgaon. It has had that side to it. But world over, you can't build a global city if you don't have high quality of life. And the presence of natural areas close to the city and even integrated with the city has almost become a global norm for high quality living. I mean, those of us who are Netflix addicts and watch TV shows set in Canada, US or Australia, that's one thing that really leaps out at you, that you have a lifestyle in which you can drive a car to work. Okay, we can question whether they should be driving a car or whether there should be a public transport or a metro or some other form of, more eco-friendly transport to work, and that also needs to change. But the thing is that when they come back home, they're walking their dog in something that looks green and natural.
Yeah.
We know that these are not pristine forests. They may be reconstructed forests. There may be many different kinds of forests. But the fact is that they have a place. So I'm here bringing in the stress and the mental health and the livability. So it's not just livability. We talked about pollution, we talked about air quality, but it's also the feeling of being able to de-stress at the end of a long day of work. And there's a concern here as a person who's a resident here, as a mother of 2 children who've grown up here, when my children come back and say that instead of a park, there's a theka coming up. Right? So how are these incentives working? And as citizens, we need to ask. I mean, it's not to put somebody else out of business. That's not my interaction. But there's intention. But there's a place and a context for everything. And as citizens, we have to put that desire forward, that when I want my children to be able to take a cycle out and cycle in a green area in the evening, rather than say, please don't walk out of the gate because there's a theka right next to it. Or I can't have you walk back from school because there are 3 thekas on the way, even if it's a 500-meter distance. And the zoning and the planning provisions actually provide for all of this, in the sense that you're not supposed to have thekas near schools, you're not supposed to have them near hospitals. So that's another thing, I think, a red flag that we need to raise, that if we are aspiring to be a global city, then we need to build a global lifestyle that is healthy physically and mentally. And then we need to question what is the correct location for other kinds of recreations, which we need, but which don't have to be located in contrast with something else that may be better for family life and community life. So those kind of sort of choices that somebody is making, somebody somewhere is deciding that these are the lands that can be auctioned for these purposes or that can be leased for these purposes. Who's making those decisions? And are those decisions being made for our well-being, for the residents of the city? That's my question here.
Absolutely. And I think you're absolutely right when you say global city or a good urban space is not just workspace, residential space, or a school space. It is beyond that, right? And so what do you do with these additional spaces which are beyond theka or liquor shops, as we know? How do you bring in neighborhood parks? How do you bring some of these that there in the neighboring cities like Delhi or Noida, you can say. So how do you bring these elements in which are very important, right? So on that, one of the other questions which often comes in, I mean, we have a lot of very good, high quality, swanky buildings and all, good residential apartments, quite premium residential apartment. But there's a huge population which is migrant, which is from the lower and middle income, and for them, housing is a big challenge. So any reflection on how do you address this? Because Gurgaon is seeing influx of people. I mean, you're all immigrants to the city, right? So how do you resolve this issue of this housing for immigrant population, low income? Because apparently the current way of things are not really working when it comes to housing.
Yeah. So, Chetan spoke extensively about protection. So I think the issue is of land. And just as we have understood that if we don't protect our forests or if we don't protect recharge zones, then we will end up with no water, and in the best case scenario, really bad water. And we now understand that, and it worries us. And to some extent, somewhere in the back of the mind, we support causes. We come out when Aravalli Bachao, Andolan or any of these activism is announced, then citizens do come out because they recognize this problem. The same kind of protections are also required for housing or for the needs of the economically weaker sections of society, because they are necessary. We need the labor. And this is a global problem. And in fact, the immigration issue globally is linked exactly to this, that I think people across the world, as in richer or more well-to-do people, are a little bit frustrated that they can't actually do away with certain kinds of laborers, certain kinds of workers. You need someone to work in the factory. You need someone to sweep the streets. You need someone to pick up your waste, to cook your food. And I mean, we all dream of a more egalitarian society, but as of now, our reality is that it is an unequal society with growing inequalities. So while those of us who have been lucky enough to make it in life are thinking of whether we should invest in real estate or not, and that's the kind of decisions that we are looking at, we forget that there are many, many people who are left behind from that. That's not the decision they're making. So the affordable housing in Indian cities in general, and particularly in Gurgaon, is literally provided by what I call leftover spaces. In Gurgaon, these happen to be urban villages, what are known as the Lal Dora areas. That's sort of the terminology that's used in the NCR, and that comes from an old sort of colonial understanding of villages, where developers are not really present, and where individual small plot owners are able to make decisions about their land. And we can be concerned about the fact that they're becoming very dense and very high, but the reality is that they are providing all the affordable housing for our city. So your maid, your driver, your everybody who earns less than, say, a household income of 25,000 a month is either living in an unauthorized land, is in a set of rental housing that is constructed on land that is where development is not possible for one or the other reason. So either a forest area or an area which is under litigation, or unauthorized land where some other it's demarcated for another use, or in an urban village. Unfortunately, this has become a sort of a problem where because there is no formal way to provide affordable housing, those protections of land that should have ideally been there, that these lands are actually demarcated for affordable housing. And from a planning perspective, that should have, again, that also, like we talked about how recycling has to happen in a place where you can walk down. So it has to happen in your neighborhood. So a plan should ideally have affordable housing reservations at a neighborhood level. But we are far from it.
So, it does. It's, so for example, and then you see how it is diverted. So, for example, apartment communities, as we all know, have a certain, it's in our legislation that, and completion rules that you have to have the so-called EWS area in every upscale luxury condo. But what actually happens in reality is that's also bought by these owners, and then it's either used as a store or a space for their drivers, or, but mostly it doesn't go to those people. So as Mukta said, I think, and this has a significant impact on the health of the city. Because these are people who, and in COVID, that became such a striking truth for all of us. Because if you are looking at all your domestic health, actually living in what are very unsanitary conditions in these urban villages, where there's no sanitation, there's no waste disposal, there is overcrowding. What is your city headed to? And this is a question which I don't think even Delhi has it's a critical problem and it's a global problem. But especially in the context of Gurgaon, where this idea of land value and developer greed is really been, sadly, the driving force of the development of the city, who steps in to sort this out? And I think that this is where I think as a citizen of Gurgaon, we would expect that the government plays a role in this, because it's not going to happen any other way. Unless there is a tangible strategy in place, protected zones, so that you're not, and because what all our urban villages are becoming slums, that's the reality. And what is happening to those communities? What is the impact, the deeper social impact of that rupture happening, right? There's so many things to consider, actually.
And also, interestingly, I teach my students this, the origin of urban planning literally comes from epidemics and disease.
Yes,
right? And we saw this in COVID, right? When the COVID hotspots, the zones that were, the zones that were where movement in and out was completely restricted were announced, and there are mappings of this. You could clearly see that it's the urban villages which have the most number of people who this thing. And when these people then move in and out, they infect everybody. So basically, we may build walls around our communities and create RWAs and rules and think that we have I live in a gated community myself, so I'm certainly not criticizing people who made that choice. That those choices were also made from a certain logic of a convenience of community living and a ability to organize ourselves better, and concerns about safety and security that the city could not provide in general. But today, when we are looking back, and many areas of the city are now fully built up, We need to rethink that. What is the relationship between these gated communities and the urban village that's often literally just outside the boundary wall? And during COVID, it was a very brief period, but very gratifying to see that relationship. So here, your usual ideas of, they are somebody else and we are a gated community broke down because there was widespread hunger, there was widespread distress, and the food for people was being cooked often in kitchens of well-to-do people, and then somebody was taking the onus of going and distributing that food to people who couldn't survive COVID because they are, living in a very hand-to-mouth situation. So for me, I think what it showed me was a different side of Gurgaon, that actually all of us have a very strong altruistic kernel to us. Whenever there is, because I work in this field, whenever there is a situation in the city, like for example riots, or any situation where there's tension and domestic workers are not able to leave their homes and work, it indirectly impacts lives. It impacts the woman who's working a corporate job, who can't leave her home because her food is not cooked for her children and her family. So we're all connected very strongly as a community, even though it may seem visually that we're disconnected. So I think we need to bring that idea back to say that if in times of distress we could create those networks of solidarity, why can't we do that today? And yes, the government has to play a role, but now that everything's built up, the government is not really going to be able to say, okay, let's bring a condominium down and create affordable housing in its place. So now what we have to work with it. So what do we do to make these urban villages better equipped? We have engineering solutions. We have so many out-of-the-box ways to make them better neighborhoods and do something for them. So we should just do that, because in protecting our service, those who service us, indirectly we protect ourselves.
Absolutely. So
the organized affordable housing, basically because land values are so high, is more or less even from the start, it is priced out for the people who actually need it. So your EWS, apartments are also going for 10,000-15,000 rupees for one small room, and it's urban white collar folks who are hiring them. If you look at any EWS complex, more than half of them have a split AC outside. They're hanging outside, which is a clear indication that it's not going for the EWS category. So the actual people who are earning 10 to 15 to 20,000 as a family, they are stuck in the shanties or the tenement homes of the village, and they're also, like, if you have an actual slum in which people have gone and set up, so they don't have rent really, by and large. They just kind of got some space which they paid for to someone, and then they don't pay rent. But here, the monthly cost for the poor is really high. So if you look at it from a per square foot perspective, they are paying, their rent is perhaps higher than many of the organized housing. So the people who are providing the service are actually laughing their way to the bank, and they're making money off the most poorest of the poor people. So if you have a 8 feet by 10 feet room, 80 square foot room, and you're paying 3,000 rupees for that, and then you can get a upscale house for 20, 25, 30,000. The poor person is paying a comparable price for a pathetic quality of living.
Let me just looking back on some of the issues that I think city also needs to address, and one such issue is about transport. So we recently came up with a report which looks at real world emission from transport, and we did this study in Gurgaon and Delhi. And we found that the real world emission from transport is very, very high compared to lab limits. The question is, how do you create transport system which are also environmental friendly, which are equitable, which serve all? And you mentioned about the housing for the poor, right? But what's the transport for the poor? So right now we have buses which are hugely inadequate compared to the population we have. So how do we add more buses? And in absence of buses, we have all these highly polluting auto rickshaws, diesel run auto rickshaws, and very, very. So the question, how do you bring in more public transport? How do you create walking spaces? How do you extend metro network, which has been stuck at that level for a very long time? I think that's going to be important, because if we don't do, the alternative is two-wheelers, cars, and people who can't afford two-wheeler cars will come back and use these informal transport system.
Yeah, so on that, actually, I'll turn the question back at you. I mean, we started as a citizenry in Gurgaon. 10 years ago, our understanding was that we're in an infrastructure deficient city. And we were, and we probably in some cases still are. But as far as road infrastructure is concerned, in the last few years, we've seen a huge push of flyovers, underpasses, many different kinds of engineering and infrastructure works. And then you're also talking about how now there's a shift, and from what I understand that you're saying, that we need to think about public modes of transport. I also hear from folks who think about transport that the more infrastructure you build, the more private transport you end up putting. And yes, so now that there's an underpass, there's more incentive for me to buy my third car in a household, typical household. How do we crack this? And is this infrastructure how is it going to serve us in the future from a quality perspective, from a design perspective? And if we make that shift, then what happens to this infrastructure?
No, I think that's important because what the infrastructure that we create, we are locking us up in that infrastructure for the next 50, 60 years.
Yeah.
So if you create a flyover, you will probably not demolish the flyover, right? It will there for some time. And if you look at some of the underpasses that have come up, have actually blocked the natural drains. So a lot of flooding happens because you now have an underpass, which was earlier there was drain, and drain is blocked on both sides. And one classical example is the Rajiv Chowk underpass that you see, which has blocked the drain. So now water cannot go, it comes on the road, it floods the underpass, and then we see what happens. So the question is, what infrastructure choices we are making and who is making that choice? And that is very important. And a lot of questions that we discussed early also to me reflects more on the governance side. I mean, if you look at global cities are driven by mayors. Unfortunately, Indian cities are driven by states. And so where is the political economy of a city at a state level is a big question, because if the cities are not going to win me elections, then why should I concentrate on city?
And at a more sort of a pedestrian level, is somebody sitting in Chandigarh going to know that the lane is getting cut when you build that flyover? Because for him, it's a line on a map. It's coming to him for a sign-off. It's a line on a map. If somebody has not drawn the drain there, then he's not seeing the drain. So he's signing on a map without adequate information. So this is a problem, right? How do we crack this? I mean,
GMDA was supposed to be kind of like so the basic stuff was to be done by the MCG, and then the GMDA was supposed to address this, the bulk water supply, the bigger planning. So the government has tried to address it, but I guess the problems are bigger than the solutions that they've thought of.
We've seen some very interesting examples of domestic help mobility. When the Wazirabad Bandh project was initiated, the largest footfall on that bandh is actually domestic help workers, women cycling on cycles through it. So what has been created is actually a safe space, because now because there are people walking there. We've added some solar powered lights also, so there is some lighting in the evenings. So you've actually taken a derelict space and made it safe for people to actually move through the city. And it cuts through the heart of all the urban communities that these domestic help workers are serving. So, I think there is a great way to link all of these problems together. The water solution, the greening Aravalli solution, or ecological conservation restoration space, equitable spaces that everybody can access, bringing communities together. So, and the other idea of in the Aravalli Biodiversity Park, I think one of the unexpected wins of the park was that the village communities around the Aravalli Biodiversity Park were reconnecting after a generation because they had been separated by development. So, I think focusing on equitable green spaces in the city is probably a solution that is going to sort out a lot of these problems, even if you can't take action in urban villages because of the now private ownership, where how are you going to get people to kind of go back on this? At least there are open spaces that are available to all that will somehow move the balance away from the direction we're going in to kind of restore what we're losing.
So one of the topics on the governance, if you look at what's been happening, is that now Gurgaon can also directly elect its mayor.
That's a new.
That's the new provision. So you were selecting the corporators and the corporate was like a mayor, but now, and then there is political issues around that. So now you can directly elect a mayor. Do you think attempts like these will improve the governance of the, one is that what's the power the mayor has compared to a MLA or a MP? So that's a separate question. But then issues like this, can they improve the governance of the city?
So, my take on this is that we don't know who these people are. Sadly, I think there's such a disconnect between a process by which you can actually have the idea is that the scale is that the mayor is connected to citizens, and therefore you have a dialogue, and therefore you can have a local solution that is only possible because of this relationship. That's not happening in our country, unfortunately, anywhere. And while it's a very good move, but unless there are actually systems in place to follow up on how these connections are going to be made, it can become just another good idea that went wrong, right? I think that the world over now, I think the shift is towards very localized solutions.
Absolutely.
Right? And I think that if it can work and that we've managed to have at least the issues on the ground communicated to people, a mayor who can actually then be given the power to actually take action and use those funds, which our councillors also have, but as we know, those funds never reach the areas for which they're actually meant. So, this whole question of making people accountable for it is the whole point. Like, if you're a mayor, you're accountable to do this for the area that you're a mayor of. And then it can lead to something very powerful.
It's always very, it amuses me that in the area, in an age of social media, where everybody is on social media and can become somebody from a nobody in a question of a few weeks or one viral post. How is it that we don't know who our councillors are, what their lives are like, what their priorities are? So I think, we're heading into an assembly election, and into a and it's an opportunity to ask these questions. And by the time the next MCG election comes around, maybe those are the questions we should be asking. Just show us who you are. Just talk to people. There is no dearth of ways to do it internally. Nobody can have that excuse that हम इरादा हम नहीं कर पाए क्योंकि बच्चे भी कर रहे हैं, उठा के रील बना रहे हैं ना. You're just placing the video camera in front, you're talking to it. So I think that's the kind of pressure that we need to place. Then we will get to accountability. If we convince our people who are aspiring to be elected representatives to actually put themselves out there in front of us. Of course,
it is a step forward, because before this, each councillor was only focusing on their ward.
Yeah.
And then some of them would it's an indirect election. What we have in rural areas is the Sarpanch post is fought for as a direct thing, and then you have ward members. So now at least there will be a couple of people who will be fighting to become the mayor of the city. So their constituency is the whole city. So far, the constituency of a councillor was their ward. So I think that hopefully that change will make, and then they'll have to have some positions on different topics that we are talking about. Maybe they'll come up with a manifesto. This is what they plan for the city. So I see it as a positive step. Absolutely. Whether our cities have enough, basically our cities don't generate enough resources. So they get subsidy from, or they get funds from the state government. So Gurgaon apparently, generates 65% of the income of the state in terms of tax and all. But the municipal bodies are basically starved of funds by and large.
In a way, because the fund is coming from state, that is also
the decision making is also there. So how much the decision making will change, we have to see.
But it also comes down to how empathetic or involved citizens are.
Absolutely.
If we are making demands in place that we're putting our labor, we've put 50 years of our labor, of our time, of our emotions, of our energies into this city, and we have a vision to make this city feel and look and be of this kind of value, then we need to also put that vision forward so that whoever is taking that decision, that state can also not ignore Gurgaon. I don't think I mean, we talk about it in our drawing rooms. I think there's a latent desire to do this, but we haven't actually come together to put that forward. So that's also an agenda that, one of us will have to take up at some point of time.
So a couple of things that we have seen is that citizens and corporates have come together to make a difference, right? So one example I know is this project called Sanath Road. It's a peculiar road in the old Gurgaon, which was earlier called Anath Road. No one owns that road. Now, institutes like Ragri Foundation and corporates came together to demonstrate what is an urban street. From a street for motor vehicle, it has become street for all category of road users. Probably Gurgaon's first streets for all, a complete street for it. Similarly, we have seen a lot of exciting development, be it by Aravalli Biodiversity Park. So we are seeing some of these examples, and maybe first I will ask you to tell us a little more about the Biodiversity Park, and then the question will become, how do we take this forward?
So, Amit, I think Chetan also mentioned earlier that the Aravalli Biodiversity Park has become an incredible example of what sensitive planting and planning and restoration work and rewilding can actually do in terms of the larger ecology. So, and that has been followed by many other projects actually, which have, each project has kind of opened up new issues in the city, allowed us to actually look at solutions that are alternative. So whether it's the Wazirabad Bandh Forest Trail, the Badshahpur Forest Trail, the Sikandarpur Pahadi, the creeks, and now Aravalli, which we're restoring actually. So it's been an incredible way to look at how it's all connected, very interestingly. And I think that the critical aspect of what we've been doing in these last 15 years also is involving thousands of citizens in the process. So what has really become a kind of a very conscious intention right at the beginning was to change this relationship between how spaces are consumed versus how spaces are co-created. So I think our dream is to actually cities where citizens are equal partners in the process of creating spaces and then monitoring those spaces and taking responsibility for those spaces. So I think there is great possibility here based on our experience where there was this whole, in the middle there was attempt to build a road through the Aravalli Biodiversity Park, and about 5,000, 6,000 school children came together to actually oppose that. Eventually that was not built, and it's now the first OECM site recognized by the UN, so hopefully protected. But it's so important to recognize the intangible value of these spaces. And I think one of the interesting exercises that could be done, I don't know who's going to do it, is how do you put a financial value to a forest? We keep talking about land value, we keep talking about luxury condominiums, but this is priceless, and the generations it's going to serve. So that's, I think there are many things that, we can kind of talk about. But I think these forest spaces are sanctuaries at another level and are going to keep giving back to the city for generations to come. So it can actually address a lot of the problems the city is facing and,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I think what I am kind of taking away from this conversation is that to make a city move forward in a positive direction, we need government, we need private sector, but we also need citizens to come together. And so we did talk about what private sector should do or not do, what government should do. One question which I want before we conclude this, what can citizens do for the city? So maybe I'll start with you, Chetan, first.
Okay, so I think very broadly, we need to examine our own lives a little bit and look at our footprint in the city. So whether how much, resources we are using and how much we are consuming, how much waste we are generating, how much water are we using, and can we, examine our kind of lives at an individual level, and if that process is supported and, incentivized by the broader systems, that makes it easier. So if, for example, my RWA says you have to segregate, then I'm much more likely to take that forward. Otherwise, it becomes a project for, 5% of the people who are ecologically minded and hum segregate kar rahe as a virtue rather than you have to segregate so that so all the things we are supposed to be doing, we should start doing some of those things. I think that's the main. And then if some people are highly motivated, they can show the way to others. So I'm a late segregator, but there are a lot of other people who are showing the way. And eventually the RWO said, we won't collect your waste if you don't segregate. And then I complied. So we should start, at least we should start complying with what we are being asked to. And we can show the path and lead in some things that make sense to us.
So I think, Gurgaon is this really interesting place where on one hand, we start countless conversations with Gurgaon mein to planning hi nahi hai. On the other hand, it's a place which has had some of the most successful placemaking projects in the country, which are showing the way for many other places. Many of these projects come because of a very, very motivated teams who really find difficult battles to make that happen. My question is, if we can be proud of our country, if we can be proud of our region, if we can be proud of our culture, our food, why can't we be proud of our city and our neighborhood? So I think it's very simple. If you're here, you've been here, you're going to be here for 2 years or 20 years, just take pride in what's around you. And instead of being caught in that apathetic sort of negative cycle of saying, I can't be proud of it because what needs to be fixed is beyond my control, taking a cue from Chetan, think about what's in your control. What's stopping you from doing something in your community that makes you proud of your community? So I think that onus is definitely on us. And once we start doing it, the systems do start falling in place. And waste segregation is a great example.
So I think this sky's the limit, frankly. I think that, as Chetan said, and I deeply believe this, that if there are 3 things each person does, right? Carry your own bottle of water. Don't touch plastic. Segregate your own waste. Carry your own bag. 3 things. That's very simple. Half your waste problems are sorted because you're not bringing extra paper or cloth or any bag into your house. So that's at the really micro level. But at a larger level, I think that we are very fortunate to be in a city where there are multiple organizations working on almost every possible aspect of city issues. And there are volunteering possibilities everywhere. I think what Mukta said about having pride in your city, and that was the central idea of Agarwal, that you are your city. It's interconnected, it's one whole. So if you want to see a difference in the city, or you want to see the city that we all came to Gurgaon for, then you have to do something about it. And there's potential to volunteer with planting, potential to volunteer with waste recycling, taking it up in your own community, working with NGO schools for underprivileged. There's so many opportunities. We're lucky that the migrant community that came to Gurgaon actually is a largely highly educated, motivated, and doers. That's what I see Gurgaon as. That's what I see as the incredible potential in Gurgaon. It's just a question that we have to have people who wake up and take responsibility and say, I'm going to make the difference, and not leave it to somebody else or complain. And the minute that personal shift happens, it will transform things.
And the last thing I'll add is a little bit of political awareness. And, we do feel very jaded we feel very defeated by a political system. But I think it's because also we don't try to understand it. So wherever it's possible to close that gap, it's our job to do it. And I think that's changing. I find, when the MCG was first set up in Gurgaon, there were a lot of conversations about, because it's an interesting space, like Swanzal said, a lot of people have come in from outside. So there's a split voting population where some of the voters are those who've been voting here for a very long time. They voted in panchayats before and now they're voting for an urban ward. And others who voted elsewhere before and now come to Gurgaon. And there is a sort of an invisible line between these 2 kinds of people in terms of who they are and what their priorities are. But after 10, 15, 20 years and in the future after 30 years, those lines are blurring in front of our eyes. Many of our priorities are now the same priorities, whether it is water or air or traffic. So there is that we don't have to sit inside our bubbles. We actually can create a little bit more, educate ourselves a little bit more. And I think that's
Absolutely. And I think I totally agree in terms of we have to take pride in a city. Yes, there are things which needs improvement. So it's absolutely also true with most other cities.
Yeah.
But then there are things which we also should feel proud of. And one of the things that I think which Gurgaon has very unique is the vibrant community. be it civil society, be it citizen group, be it a lot of corporates are very positive and whatnot. The big question is, how do we bring these things together and maybe bring the government, bring the civil society, bring the corporates together, and then use that as a solution generating framework? Because cities are changing. They're changing very fast. And our traditional approach for managing, governing cities will really not deliver us. The question is, how do we leverage the citizens and the citizen movements and the private sector is a big opportunity for us. So on that note, thank you, Chetan, Mukta, Swanzal, for a fantastic piece of conversation. This, as I said, is the first of the many episodes that will come on the Gurgaon first. We are just trying to understand the nitty-gritties of the city, but we're also trying to come up with what's the possible solution to make Gurgaon first. Thank you.